My father pushed me over the coffee table and called me an ugly bitch who couldn't keep my brother in control. When I tried to stand back up, he kicked my legs and said, "Get the EF out of here." I stayed silent. That was the night I called my sister in tears. Yesterday, he was standing outside family therapy, red-faced and shaking. My parents forced me to shut my mouth and stay invisible so I'd never end up like my sister Millie. Millie always stirred trouble when she was around. My dad would always hurt my brother and I, but Millie would always stand up for us and herself. One time on vacation to Hawaii, I made the terrible decision to wear jean shorts. I was only 12 and Millie was 15. My dad slapped my thigh and told me I was putting on pounds, even though I was a size 2. I looked at Millie, signaling her to just stay quiet. But then my dad pulled my shorts and told me, "Nobody wants to see legs like those." That's when she said, "Well, nobody wants to stare at your moldy back rolls, but I guess none of us got a say in that matter." Suddenly, the entire room, including me, started screaming at her. Told her how she was a troublemaker. Looking back, I obviously regret it. But I was brainwashed. Because somehow my parents had convinced me that it's their responsibility to be abusive, but speaking back was what caused an issue. And it didn't stop there. Because that's when Evan did the only form of protection he knew at the time. He plastered this boyish smirk on his face, pretending like he didn't give an F about anything my dad did or said. Next thing I knew, our dad was yelling at Evan and threatening to hit him. So that night, Millie slept in the same bed as us, covering Evan in case our dad came in the middle of the night and tried anything. But as the years continued, things only got worse. Evan used to be a sweet boy. He used to tuck me and Millie in with a blanket whenever we fell asleep on the couch. Tell us that we were pretty. But as my dad got more abusive, so did he. So by the time he was 16, he was just another angry man in the house. But Millie never lost her flair of assertiveness, and I continued to be the one to cry at the first sign of conflict. This dynamic pretty much continued until Millie was in senior year. It was the night before her SAT, and we were all sitting around the table eating dinner. She was the only one in our family that cared about school. Her hands were trembling. She had that faraway look in her eye. Well, that's when she asked Evan to stop chewing with his mouth open. "You're going to fail your SATs and be an effing failure for the rest of your life," he yelled. Suddenly, Millie stood up in tears and ran up to her bedroom. My dad began shouting at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the walls. Meanwhile, I stayed in the kitchen, texting Millie and asking why she would react to him saying that she had once again destroyed the peace in our family. We didn't see her much after that. She was always at her friend's house or secretly out partying. And I never texted her either. Because to me, she was the one who had destroyed the family. But the less I saw her, the more I realized how wrong I was. Because suddenly, I became the new scapegoat. Every day my dad was barking orders at me, and no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, even he was too scared of Evan to tell him to do anything. But Millie never stopped trying for me. Once in a while, she would come home and criticize our parents. And I didn't even appreciate it until one day, when our dad caught Evan putting his wet clothes on top of my mom's dry ones. Dad was screaming at Evan, when suddenly my name was called for me to come into the living room. As soon as I walked in, my dad called me an ugly bitch who couldn't keep my brother in control. And while I silently processed his words, he pushed me over the coffee table. Tears were streaming down my face and fear filled my veins. When I tried to stand back up, he kicked the back of my legs and knocked me over again. "Get the F out of here." Well, he didn't have to tell me twice. I immediately ran to the bathroom and locked the door. I called the first person I could think of, Millie. I told her everything. She talked to me in that soft voice that always managed to calm me down. As I sat on the cold bathroom floor, my dad screamed at me again and ordered me to clean the kitchen, so I hung up with no explanation. Well, 20 minutes later, I heard the front door silently creak open. Millie walked in with her 6'4" muscular boyfriend. I stared at her with fear, not wanting to leave in case my dad punished me even worse. And I guess she picked up on it, because she immediately grabbed my hand. Her eyes were filled with comfort, like she knew what she was doing. Before I knew it, she had convinced me to leave with her, and we went to an apartment I didn't even know she had been renting out. I tucked myself into bed, and she asked me to again explain what happened, to tell her what she had missed. But I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just wanted to focus on the Halloween party that I had planned for the next day. So I violently shook my head and Millie nodded before ordering me McDonald's. But I never got to go to my party. Because the next day, my mom texted me about how I had to come home, how Millie had done enough damage to all of us. And I believed her. But as soon as I walked in the door, my dad hit me so hard I blacked out. I woke up on the cold kitchen floor, my head pounding like someone was hammering nails into my skull. My father stood over me, arms crossed, shaking his head with that familiar look of disappointment. My mother hovered behind him, wringing her hands and nodding along to whatever narrative he was spinning. "She fainted from being dramatic," my father announced to no one in particular, always making a scene, just like her sister. I tried to sit up, but the room spun violently. My hand instinctively went to the back of my head where a tender lump was already forming. The memory of the impact came rushing back, the force of his hand, the crack against the wall, then nothing. "Get up," my mother commanded, her voice sharp. "Dinner's getting cold." I struggled to my feet, gripping the counter for support. Every movement sent waves of nausea through my body, but I forced myself to walk to the dining room. Evan was already seated, scrolling through his phone with practiced indifference. My father launched into his version of events as soon as we sat down. "Your sister had another one of her mental breakdowns," he explained to Evan, gesturing with his fork. The motion of his hand cutting through the air matched exactly how he'd struck me earlier. Started screaming about nothing, then passed out like she always does when she doesn't get her way. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell Evan the truth, but the words came out thick and slurred. "He hit me." Evan looked up from his phone, disgust crossing his face. "Are you hammered? God, you're pathetic." "I'm not." I tried again, but my tongue felt too heavy, my thoughts scattered like puzzle pieces I couldn't fit together. "See what I mean?" my father said, shaking his head. "This is what happens when Millie gets in her head. Now she's coming home intoxicated." My mother cleared her throat. "Speaking of which, I need you to babysit the Henderson kids tomorrow. They're paying $40 and we need the extra income." She paused, fixing me with a cold stare. "Unless you're not really part of this family anymore?" The threat hung in the air. I knew what she meant. Loyalty was currency in our house, and choosing Millie meant bankruptcy. My phone buzzed on the table. Millie's name flashed on the screen. My father's hand shot out, but I grabbed it first, clutching it to my chest. "I should go to the hospital," I said, the words coming clear now despite the pain. My head. "Absolutely not," my father interrupted, his voice dropping to that dangerous low tone. You know, I've been thinking about checking on Millie, making sure she's okay in that apartment of hers. What's the address again? Maple Street? My blood ran cold. He knew exactly where she lived. The threat was clear. Leave for the hospital, and he'd go after her instead. I'll stay, I whispered. Good choice. He smiled, satisfied. Now you should probably call your friends and explain why you missed that Halloween party. Tell them you came home hammered and we had to take care of you. I stared at my plate, the food blurring through my tears. My phone continued buzzing with messages, each one a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. Friends asking where I was, if I was okay, why I hadn't shown up in my costume we'd spent weeks planning. I'm sorry, I finally said, the words tasting like ash. Sorry for what? My mother prompted. For causing problems? Louder, my father commanded. Mrs. Henderson is on the porch. She should hear what kind of daughter we're dealing with. I raised my voice, hating myself with each word. I'm sorry for causing problems. I'm sorry for coming home hammered. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Henderson pause on her evening walk, clearly catching my confession. My father nodded approvingly. After dinner, I escaped to the bathroom, my head still spinning. In the mirror, my pupils were different sizes. One dilated, one pinpoint. I knew enough from health class to recognize the signs of a concussion, but seeking help meant leaving Millie vulnerable. Back in the kitchen, I noticed the dark stain on the corner of the counter. My blood. Evidence of what really happened. I reached for the cleaning spray, then stopped. Cleaning it would mean acknowledging it happened. Leaving it meant someone might notice, might ask questions. What are you staring at? Evan's voice made me jump. Nothing, I said quickly, stepping away from the counter. He studied me for a moment, then shrugged. Dad's right, you know. You're starting to act just like Millie, always dramatizing everything. But I'm not. Save it, he cut me off. I was there when you stumbled in. Dad had to catch you before you hurt yourself. You should be grateful. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, I almost believed it myself. Maybe I had stumbled. Maybe the pain in my head was from falling, not from being struck. Maybe. My phone buzzed again. Millie. Are you okay? Please answer me. I glanced around, then quickly typed back. I'm fine. Don't come here. But my father appeared behind me before I could hit send. Who are you texting? No one, I said, trying to delete the message. He snatched the phone from my hands, reading the screen. Seems like you're not fine after all. And telling Millie not to come here? That sounds like you're planning something. I'm not. I think you need a break from this. He pocketed my phone. For your own good. You're clearly not thinking straight. The walls felt like they were closing in. Without my phone, I had no way to warn Millie, no way to call for help, no way to document what was happening. I was completely isolated. That night, I lay in bed fighting waves of nausea and dizziness. Every time I closed my eyes, the room spun violently. I knew I should stay awake with a head injury, but exhaustion pulled at me. Through my door, I heard my parents talking in low voices. She needs to see the school counselor about those college applications, my mother said. The deadline is coming up. She's not seeing anyone without me there, my father replied. I'll sign whatever needs signing, but I'm not having her spread lies about this family. What if she tells someone about tonight? Who's going to believe her? She admitted to being hammered in front of the neighbor. Her friends all got texts saying she was too wasted to come to the party. Even Evan saw her stumbling around. He chuckled. Sometimes I impress myself. The next morning, I woke to my mother shaking me roughly. Get up, you have school. Everything hurt. My head throbbed, my vision blurred at the edges, and my stomach turned threateningly. But missing school would mean questions, concerns, mandatory reporter obligations. I forced myself through my morning routine, avoiding the mirror and the questions it would raise. Downstairs, my father sat at the kitchen table with my phone in pieces in front of him. Just checking for any inappropriate content, he said casually. Can't be too careful these days. At school, I struggled to focus. The fluorescent light stabbed at my eyes, and reading made the words swim on the page. In third period, I stumbled getting up from my desk, catching myself on another student's chair. Whoa, rough night? Jake asked, studying me. Before I could answer, Mrs. Patterson intervened. Are you feeling all right? You look pale. I'm fine, I managed, but she was already writing a hall pass. Nurse's office. Now. The nurse took one look at my eyes and frowned. Have you been drinking? No, Your pupils are different sizes. That's often a sign of intoxication or substance use. She made a note on her clipboard. I'll need to call your parents. Please don't, I begged, but she was already dialing. 20 minutes later, my mother arrived, playing the concerned parent perfectly. I'm so sorry. She came home intoxicated last night. We've been trying to handle it as a family, but clearly she needs more help than we can provide. The nurse nodded sympathetically. Teenage drinking is more common than we'd like. There are resources available. I sat there, mute, as they discussed my fictional substance abuse problem. Every protest would sound like denial. Every truth would seem like a lie. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispers and sideways glances. Word traveled fast in high school. By lunch, everyone knew I'd been sent to the nurse for being hammered at school. Hey, my best friend Sarah approached cautiously. Are you okay? I heard. I'm fine, I said automatically. You missed an awesome party last night. We waited for you for like an hour. She paused, studying my face. Your mom called my mom this morning. Said you've been going through something since your grandma died. That you're struggling. My grandma died 2 years ago, I said, confused. Yeah, but grief can manifest in weird ways, right? My mom said maybe I should give you some space while you work through things. Sarah, I'm not. I believe you, she said quickly. I mean, I believe something's wrong. But my mom, she doesn't want any drama near me with college applications coming up. I'm sorry. She walked away, leaving me alone at the lunch table. One by one, my other friends found excuses to sit elsewhere. The isolation was complete. After school, I waited by Sarah's car, hoping to explain, to make her understand. But her mother appeared first, car keys jingling. I think it's best if you find another way home, she said, not unkindly but firmly. Sarah needs to focus on her studies. The walk home took 40 minutes. Each step sent spikes of pain through my head, but the alternative was calling my parents for a ride. I'd rather suffer. When I finally reached our street, I saw my father's truck in the driveway, and my heart sank. He was supposed to be at work. Nothing good ever came from him being home early. Inside, I found him in the living room with our family laptop open. Perfect timing, he said without looking up. Your counselor sent the college application forms. They need a parent signature. I can sign. No. His voice was final. I'll review everything first. Can't have you applying to schools too far away. Family should stick together. My phone sat on the coffee table, reassembled but clearly tampered with. When I reached for it, he grabbed my wrist. Did you know your sister has been texting you? Worried sick, apparently? I told her you were fine, just going through a phase. He smiled coldly. She wanted to come check on you, but I explained how that would just make things worse. What did you tell her? The truth. That you came home hammered, that you're struggling with some mental health issues, that we're getting you help. He released my wrist, leaving red marks. She seemed disappointed but not surprised. Said you'd been acting strange lately. None of that sounded like Millie, but without my phone, I couldn't verify what was real and what was fabrication. That evening, the family group chat became a minefield. My aunt had added me back after months of silence, and I watched in horror as my parents painted a picture of a troubled teen spiraling out of control. We found empty bottles in her room, my mother typed. We're considering an intervention. She's been collecting evidence against us for years, my father added. Photos, recordings, like she's paranoid we're out to get her. That's concerning, my aunt replied. Has she seen a professional? We're working on it. She's resistant to help. I wanted to scream the truth, but I knew how it would look. Denial, deflection. Exactly what a guilty person would do. My cousin chimed in. This sounds just like when Millie went through her phase. Remember how she used to make up stories? Exactly, my father responded. We're hoping to avoid the same outcome. The messages continued, each one building a narrative I couldn't fight. They'd screenshot my old texts complaining about strict rules, reframing normal teenage frustration as signs of long-term mental instability. They shared photos where I looked upset or angry, evidence of my difficult nature. I realized with growing horror that this had been planned. Every piece of evidence had been carefully cultivated, waiting for the right moment to deploy. That night, unable to sleep from the pain and nausea, I crept downstairs for water. In the kitchen, I froze. The bloodstain on the counter was gone, scrubbed clean. But something else caught my eye. My mother's recipe box, left open on the table. Inside, between recipes for pot roast and apple pie, I found index cards with strange notes. When he's in a mood, suggest bowling. Physical activity helps. Don't serve pasta on Thursdays, reminds him of his father. Keep the children quiet after 8 p.m., trigger time. These weren't recipes. They were survival tactics, years of documentation on how to manage my father's temper. My mother had been keeping track all along, coding her observations in the most mundane hiding place possible. Couldn't sleep? I spun around to find my mother in the doorway, her face unreadable. I was just getting water, I know. She moved past me, closing the recipe box with practiced casualness. You should be more careful, walking around in the dark with a head injury. You could fall. The threat was subtle but clear. Accidents happen in the dark. People fall. Stories get confused. I returned to bed, my mind racing. The recipe cards proved my mother knew exactly what my father was capable of. She'd been documenting it for years, but instead of protecting us, she'd used that knowledge to enable him, to manage his moods rather than challenge them. Morning brought new challenges. My father announced at breakfast that he'd signed up to coach the neighborhood softball team. Contributing to the community, he said with false modesty. Being a positive male role model. I recognized the strategy. Public visibility. Community involvement. Building a reputation that would make any accusation seem impossible. Who would believe that the devoted softball coach was capable of abuse? At school, I tried to focus despite the persistent headache and dizzy spells. In English class, we were discussing unreliable narrators, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I was living as an unreliable narrator in my own life, my truth constantly undermined by manufactured evidence. Sometimes, the teacher explained, the most dangerous lies are the ones with kernels of truth. They're harder to dispute because they feel partially real. After class, she held me back. Is everything all right? You seem distracted. For a moment, I considered telling her everything, but then I remembered my father's words about Millie's apartment, the implicit threat hanging over any rebellion. I'm fine, I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. Just tired. She studied me for a long moment, and I could see her internal debate. Push further or respect boundaries? Finally, she nodded. If you need to talk. I know, thank you. But we both knew I wouldn't. The system that was supposed to protect me had too many holes, too many ways for my parents to slip through. That afternoon, I made a decision. If I couldn't fight their narrative directly, I'd have to be smarter. I started paying attention to details, memorizing patterns, noting inconsistencies. Without my phone to document, I'd have to rely on my memory. But memory, I was learning, was a fragile thing. The concussion made everything fuzzy at the edges. Sometimes I'd remember things that didn't quite match reality, or forget conversations that others insisted happened. My father exploited this mercilessly. You said you'd babysit tonight, he announced after school. I don't remember. Of course you don't. That's why I'm here to help you remember. He produced a handwritten note, supposedly in my writing. See? You agreed yesterday. The handwriting looked like mine, but I had no memory of writing it. The uncertainty was maddening. Maybe I had agreed. Maybe the head injury was affecting more than I realized. The Henderson kids were sweet but exhausting. Every sudden movement made my head throb, and their high-pitched squeals felt like knives in my skull. But I smiled and played games, aware that Mrs. Henderson would report back to my parents about my behavior. When she returned, she studied me carefully. Your father mentioned you've been having some troubles. I'm fine, I said automatically. He's worried about you. Said you've been making accusations, acting paranoid. She handed me 2 20s, then paused. You know, if something's really wrong, there are people who can help. For a second, I thought she understood, that she was offering real help. Then she continued. My sister's a therapist. She specializes in teenage behavioral issues. I could give your parents her number. Behavioral issues. Not trauma, not abuse. Behavioral issues, like I was the problem to be fixed. Thank you, I managed. I'll let them know. Walking home, I felt the weight of the trap closing around me. Every avenue of help led back to the same narrative. I was troubled, difficult, dramatic, just like Millie had been. But thinking of Millie gave me strength. She'd survived this. She'd escaped. And somehow, despite everything, she'd maintained her sense of self, her willingness to fight back. In my room, I found my phone plugged in and charging. When I opened it, I discovered all my messages with Millie had been deleted. Our entire conversation history, years of support and shared experiences, erased. A new message appeared from her number. Hey, Dad explained everything. I'm giving you space to work through your issues. Please don't contact me until you're better. I need to focus on my own healing. The words were all wrong. Millie would never abandon me, never tell me not to contact her. But without our message history, I had no proof of what she would or wouldn't say. Downstairs, I heard my father on the phone, his voice carrying that false concern he'd perfected. Yes, we're very worried about her. She's been fixated on her sister, almost stalking her. We've had to intervene. Each word built another bar in my cage. By the time he hung up, he'd painted a picture of an obsessed, unstable teenager harassing her older sister, who just wanted to move on with her life. Who was that? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Millie's roommate. Apparently you've been calling from different numbers, showing up at her work. He shook his head sadly. This has to stop. I haven't. The phone records say otherwise. He produced a printed call log, highlighting dozens of calls to unfamiliar numbers. These are all places Millie frequents. The coffee shop where she studies, her gym, her friends' houses. I stared at the paper, confused. I recognized my phone number, but not the calls. They were made at times I was in school, asleep, or my phone was confiscated. I don't understand. Of course you don't. That's why we're trying to help you. His voice was patient, patronizing. The mind can play tricks when it's unwell. You probably don't remember making these calls, but that doesn't mean they didn't happen. The gaslighting was so sophisticated, so complete, that I felt my grip on reality slipping. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the head injury had caused more damage than I thought. Maybe. I need some air, I said, standing too quickly. The room tilted, and I grabbed the table for support. Careful, my father said. We wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. Outside, I walked aimlessly, trying to clear my head. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, the perfect suburban facade. But underneath, I now saw the cracks, the way curtains twitched when I passed, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. My family's narrative had spread like poison through the community. At the park, I sat on a bench and tried to think clearly. The facts were simple. My father had hit me. I had a concussion. My parents were systematically destroying my credibility. Millie was in danger if I tried to leave. But the simple facts were buried under layers of manipulation, each lie building on the last until the truth seemed impossible to extract. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, then recognized the area code, Millie's college town. Hello? Silence, then a whispered voice. Don't react. Just listen. This is Millie. I borrowed a friend's phone. Are you safe? My heart leaped, but I kept my face neutral, aware that neighbors might be watching. Yes. I know what they're doing. I've been through it. Can you get to the library tomorrow after school? I'll try. Be careful. Delete this call from your log. I love you. The line went dead. I immediately deleted the call history, my hands shaking. Millie hadn't abandoned me. She was trying to help, working around the barriers my parents had built. But hope was dangerous in my house. It made you careless, vulnerable. I had to be smarter than that. That night at dinner, my father announced his latest community involvement. I'd been asked to give a talk at the school about family values and supporting troubled teens. The irony was suffocating. He'd positioned himself as an expert on the very thing he was perpetrating. It was genius in its audacity. That's wonderful, my mother cooed. You have so much wisdom to share. Evan grunted his agreement through a mouthful of food. He'd perfected the art of minimal interaction, present but not participating. I envied his ability to disappear in plain sight. I thought I'd share our story, my father continued, watching me carefully. How we're handling the challenges with grace and patience. Of course, I'll respect your privacy. The threat was clear. Behave or become a cautionary tale for the entire school. After dinner, I helped clear the table, moving carefully to avoid triggering another dizzy spell. In the kitchen, I noticed my mother's recipe box had been moved, tucked high on a shelf. Our moment of connection, however brief, was over. Your father's trying so hard, she said, scrubbing dishes with unnecessary force. The least you could do is appreciate it. He hit me, I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. She paused, her hand still in the soapy water. For a moment, I thought she might acknowledge it, might finally choose truth over comfort. You fell, she said firmly. You were hammered and you fell. That's what happened. Mom, please. That's what happened. She turned to face me and I saw something in her eyes. Not denial, but defeat. She knew the truth. She just couldn't afford to acknowledge it. I understood then that my mother wasn't just enabling my father. She was trapped in her own web of survival, her recipe cards a testament to years of careful navigation. Challenging him meant risking everything, and she'd chosen the devil she knew. That night, I lay awake planning. The library tomorrow. Millie. A chance to figure out next steps. But I had to be careful. One wrong move and my father would follow through on his threats. I thought about the evidence I'd need to prove my case. Medical records showing the concussion, witnesses to my father's violence, documentation of the gaslighting. But every piece of evidence could be explained away, reframed as the delusions of a troubled teenager. The game was rigged, but I had to play anyway. Because the alternative, accepting their narrative, becoming the broken child they painted me as, was a different kind of death. As sleep finally claimed me, I held on to one thought. Millie had survived this. She'd found a way out. Which meant maybe, just maybe, so could I. The morning sun stabbed through my bedroom curtains like needles. My head still throbbed from the concussion, but I forced myself through my routine. The library meeting with Millie consumed my thoughts as I carefully selected clothes that would hide any new bruises. At breakfast, my father studied me over his coffee mug. He'd started coaching the Henderson's daughters softball team yesterday, and already the neighborhood treated him like a hero. 3 parents had texted thanking him for his dedication to the community. My mother placed scrambled eggs in front of me, her movements precise and mechanical. The recipe box remained on its high shelf, those coded survival instructions just out of reach. I noticed she'd started wearing long sleeves despite the warm weather. School passed in a blur of whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The narrative my parents had crafted spread through social media like wildfire. Someone had screenshot my old Instagram posts complaining about curfew, adding them to a concerned parent Facebook group as evidence of my long-standing rebellious nature. During lunch, I overheard two girls from my chemistry class discussing me. One mentioned how her mother worked at the pharmacy and had seen my father picking up anxiety medication for me. The prescription I'd never taken, for a condition I didn't have, became another brick in the wall of lies surrounding me. The final bell rang, and I headed toward the library, taking a circuitous route through the park. My father's truck wasn't in the school parking lot, but I'd learned to be paranoid. Every car could be watching. Every neighbor might report back. Inside the library, I found Millie in the furthest corner, hidden behind the reference section. She looked thinner than I remembered, dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me, her face crumbled with relief and worry. She pulled me into a fierce hug, and I felt her checking for injuries with practiced subtlety. Her hands paused at the tender spot on my skull, and her jaw tightened. She guided me to sit at a study table, positioning us so we could see anyone approaching. Millie slid a notebook across to me. Written in her neat handwriting were instructions. Write everything. They might be recording. My heart sank. Even here, we couldn't speak freely. I wrote about the concussion, the gaslighting, the community manipulation. My hand cramped as I detailed the recipe box discovery, the deleted messages, the false narrative spreading through town. Millie read each page, her face growing paler. She wrote back, "Same pattern as me. It'll escalate. Dad's building his public image before the real damage." We spent an hour communicating through written notes, Millie sharing her own experience and warning me about what was coming. She documented everything during her time at home, but our parents had found her evidence and used it against her, claiming she'd been planning to frame them for years. A librarian approached, and we quickly switched to studying from textbooks we'd grabbed. She smiled at us, but I caught her taking a second glance, as if trying to place us. My paranoia spiked. Millie scribbled one final note. "Emergency phone hidden in the park bathroom taped under the sink. Only for real emergencies. They're watching everything else." We parted ways separately, Millie leaving first while I pretended to continue studying. My hands shook as I gathered the notes we'd written, tearing them into tiny pieces and flushing them down the library bathroom toilet. The walk home took longer than usual. My father's truck sat in the driveway, and my stomach clenched. He was supposed to be at softball practice. Inside, I found him in the living room with my school counselor. They both looked up as I entered, twin expressions of concern on their faces. My counselor spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. She explained that my teachers had noticed concerning behavior, falling grades, social isolation, apparent intoxication at school. She'd come to discuss intervention options with my parents. My father played his role perfectly, the worried parent desperate to help his struggling child. He mentioned finding me passed out, my concerning obsession with my sister, the calls to Millie's friends and workplace, each lie built upon the last, creating an elaborate architecture of deception. I sat frozen as they discussed treatment programs, therapy options, and the importance of family support. My counselor had brought pamphlets about teenage substance abuse and mental health facilities. The trap was closing. When she finally left, my father turned to me with cold satisfaction. He informed me that I'd be taking a break from school to focus on my health. He'd already called to arrange it, citing medical needs. The isolation would be complete. That night, I snuck out to the park bathroom after my parents went to bed. My hands fumbled under the sink until I found the phone Millie had hidden, wrapped in plastic and duct tape. I memorized its hiding spot and left it there, knowing I'd need it when things got worse. They did. The next morning, my father presented me with a therapy appointment. The therapist, recommended by Mrs. Henderson's sister, specialized in troubled teens. I had no choice but to attend. The session was a masterclass in manipulation. Everything I said was twisted through the lens of my supposed mental health crisis. When I mentioned feeling trapped, it became paranoia. When I described my father's anger, it transformed into my inability to accept reasonable parental boundaries. The therapist took notes that would later become evidence of my instability. Over the following days, the news tightened. My father had installed a location tracking app on my phone, for my safety. My mother started checking my room daily, looking for evidence of substance abuse or self-harm. They found my journal and read it aloud at dinner, pointing out passages that showed my distorted thinking. Evan began telling extended family that I was sick like Millie had been. He'd perfected the concerned brother act, shaking his head sadly when asked about me. The family group chat filled with prayers for my recovery and offers to help my parents through this difficult time. I discovered the true extent of the surveillance when I tried to use the school library computer to email a teacher. My father appeared within minutes, having received an alert about my login attempt. He explained to the librarian that I was on restricted internet access due to cyberbullying concerns. Another avenue closed. The softball team threw a party for my father after their first win. Parents praised his coaching style, his dedication, his positive influence on their daughters. He quoted the same movie lines he'd used to motivate us before beating us, and they found him inspirational. At home, the violence escalated subtly. A shove here, a twisted wrist there, always deniable, always my fault. When I stumbled at dinner, my mother noted it as evidence of my ongoing substance issues. When bruises appeared, they were self-inflicted attention-seeking behavior. The therapist introduced the idea of inpatient treatment. My parents played reluctant, wanting to try home intervention first, but I could see the groundwork being laid. Soon I'd disappear into a facility, and any accusations I made would be dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill teenager. One evening, while organizing family photos for a project, I noticed a pattern. Every Christmas card showed us positioned carefully, my mother's bruises hidden by strategic angles, our forced smiles identical year after year. The evidence had been in plain sight, but no one wanted to see it. My aunt called from out of state, having heard about my troubles. She offered to take me for a few weeks, give my parents a break. But I heard my father decline, explaining that consistency was important for my recovery. He couldn't risk me talking to someone outside his control. The school sent work home, but my father reviewed it first, removing any assignments that might let me communicate with teachers. My isolation was nearly complete, broken only by supervised therapy sessions where every word was weaponized against me. I started playing their game, acting remorseful and accepting their version of events. It made them suspicious at first, but gradually they began to believe in my improvement. The therapy sessions focused on my progress and accepting responsibility for my behavior. During a family dinner where I performed perfectly, my mother actually smiled at me. But later, I found her adding new notes to her recipe cards. Compliance might indicate planning, and watch for signs of deception. The emergency phone in the park became my lifeline to sanity. Late at night, I'd sneak out to check for messages from Millie. She sent encouragement and warnings, reminding me to document everything I could. But documentation was nearly impossible under constant surveillance. My father started bringing me to softball practices, showcasing his reformed daughter to the community. I smiled and helped with equipment while parents nodded approvingly at his dedication to my recovery. One mother pulled me aside to say how lucky I was to have such caring parents. The medical records for my concussion mysteriously vanished from the patient portal. When I asked about it during a supervised doctor's visit, I was told there must be a system error. My father's concerned expression never wavered as the doctor explained that head injuries could cause memory confusion. Evan's girlfriend, Thay, started coming to family dinners. She watched our dynamics with sharp eyes, noticing things others missed. When Evan snapped at me for passing the salt wrong, she touched his arm gently. He subsided, but I caught her troubled expression. The therapy sessions expanded to include family meetings. My parents presented a united front of concern and love while I sat silent, knowing any protest would be labeled as resistance to treatment. The therapist praised their patience with my difficult behavior. One night, I discovered my mother in the kitchen at 3 a.m., studying her recipe cards by flashlight. She'd added new entries. Thursday. Bowling suggestion failed. Movie instead. And pasta triggered memory of his mother. Avoid indefinitely. Her system was breaking down as his triggers multiplied. My father announced he'd been asked to speak at a parenting conference about supporting troubled teens. He practiced his speech at dinner, describing our journey with theatrical emotion. The irony of him teaching others about healthy parenting while systematically destroying his own children made me physically ill. During one of his softball practices, I overheard him talking to a parent about military school options. He painted it as concern for structure and discipline I needed. The parent sympathized, sharing her own struggles with her teenager. Another escape route closing. The therapist introduced medication for my supposed anxiety and depression. I tried refusing, but my parents had medical power of attorney for mental health decisions. The pills made me foggy and compliant, exactly as intended. Millie managed to call during one of my father's games using a teammate's phone. Her voice was strained as she told me about receiving legal documents. Our parents were seeking a restraining order against her, claiming I needed protection from her negative influence. The final isolation was coming. I found evidence of my mother's past escape attempt while cleaning the attic under supervision. Hidden in an old suitcase were apartment listings, job applications, and a half-finished letter to a women's shelter. All dated 5 years ago, abandoned when something changed her mind. The community fully embraced my father's narrative. When I walked through town, conversation stopped. Mothers pulled their children closer. The pharmacist spoke slowly to me, as if I might not understand. I'd become the cautionary tale my father had crafted. During a particularly bad episode where my father grabbed my arm hard enough to leave fingerprints, I made the mistake of pulling away in front of Evan. His rage at my defiance exceeded even my father's. The sweet boy who once tucked us in had fully transformed into another abuser. The therapy notes I glimpsed during a session revealed the groundwork for long-term institutionalization. Phrases like treatment-resistant and potential danger to self peppered the pages. My father had found his final solution. I started planning my own escape, but every avenue seemed blocked. No money, no transportation, no allies except Millie, who was being legally barred from contact. The emergency phone remained hidden, but using it risked everything if discovered. One afternoon, while my parents attended a school conference about my absence, I found my grandmother's old jewelry box in my mother's closet. Inside, beneath tangled necklaces, were photographs. My mother, young and bruised, holding baby Millie. The cycle stretching back generations, each woman choosing survival over escape. The conference resulted in a formal plan for my return to school with strict conditions. Constant supervision, no unsupervised peer interaction, daily check-ins with the counselor. It felt less like education and more like minimum security prison. My father's softball team made it to the regional championships. The local newspaper ran a feature on him, praising his volunteer work and dedication to youth sports. They quoted him about the importance of positive male role models. The article hung on our refrigerator, a daily reminder of his public persona. During a mandated family therapy session, the therapist suggested we do an exercise where we shared our perspectives on a recent conflict. My parents described my attempt to leave the house without permission as a safety concern. I sat silent, knowing my version would only confirm my supposed oppositional behavior. They started leaving small gifts for me. A bookmark, a hair tie, nothing that would draw attention. But I understood the message. She saw what was happening. She couldn't intervene directly, but she was witnessing. It was the smallest comfort, but I clung to it. The medication doses increased when I showed signs of agitation, which meant any emotion beyond blank compliance. The fog in my brain made it hard to think clearly, to plan, to remember why fighting mattered. Sometimes I wondered if accepting their reality would be easier. My mother added locks to the kitchen drawers after finding me looking at the knives. Not for what she feared, but because I'd been checking for evidence of her recipe card system. She'd moved them again, always one step ahead in our silent chess game. The restraining order against Millie was approved. My parents presented evidence of her interference with my treatment, her attempts to contact me despite requests to stop, her history of mental health issues. The judge, concerned for my well-being, granted it without questioning the source. I learned about it when my father showed me the paperwork, explaining it was for my own good. Millie's influence had always been toxic, he said. Now I could focus on getting better without her drama. The last thread connecting me to reality was officially severed. That night, I snuck to the park bathroom one final time. The emergency phone had one message from Millie. Don't give up. Document everything. I'm working on something, hold on. But holding on felt impossible when reality itself was negotiable, when truth was whatever my parents decided it was. The girl who'd worn jean shorts in Hawaii felt like a stranger. That defiant 12-year-old had been systematically erased, replaced by whatever this broken thing was. My father signed me up for a summer program at a therapeutic boarding school. Just to try it out, he said. See if a change of environment helped. But I knew once I went, I wouldn't come back. This was the endgame he'd been building toward. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday. I had 2 weeks before departure. 2 weeks to find a way out of an inescapable trap. 2 weeks before I disappeared into a system designed to break the last pieces of me that remembered the truth. As I lay in bed that night, listening to my parents discuss logistics in the living room below, I thought about those recipe cards. My mother had survived decades by managing his moods, documenting triggers, adapting constantly. But survival wasn't living, and I was running out of time to choose anything else. The morning would bring new challenges, new manipulations, new evidence of my supposed illness. But somewhere out there, Millie was working on something. And sometimes, hope was all you had. Even when hope felt like delusion. Even when the walls closed in. Even when tomorrow looked like a prison. I would hold on. The morning of my departure for the therapeutic boarding school arrived with suffocating finality. My packed bag sat by the door while my mother busied herself making breakfast, her movements sharp and efficient. The recipe cards had vanished completely now, hidden somewhere I'd never find them. My father reviewed the boarding school paperwork one final time, highlighting sections about restricted communication and supervised visits. The program specialized in breaking down resistant teenagers and rebuilding them into compliant young adults. He'd chosen well. At breakfast, Evan avoided eye contact while scrolling through his phone. They sat beside him, her presence the only thing keeping his temper in check. She'd started spending more nights at our house, witnessing everything but powerless to intervene directly. The doorbell rang, interrupting our silent meal. My father answered it, returning with my aunt who'd driven 3 hours to see me off. She hugged me tightly, whispering apologies about not being able to help more. Her own dependence on my father's construction business for her son's medical bills kept her complicit. Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a care package for my journey, homemade cookies, and a journal for my thoughts. She patted my shoulder sympathetically, fully believing she was supporting a troubled teen getting necessary help. The entire neighborhood had bought into my parents' narrative. My mother checked her watch repeatedly, anxious about the departure time. She'd packed my medications in a clear bag, the pills that kept me foggy and compliant prominently displayed. The boarding school would continue the regimen, ensuring I remained manageable. Loading my bags into the car, I noticed my father had installed new locks on all the doors. Even if I somehow escaped the boarding school and made it home, I'd find no refuge here. Every escape route had been methodically eliminated. They approached me while my parents were distracted, pressing something small into my palm. A folded piece of paper with a phone number. She squeezed my hand briefly before returning to Evan's side, her face carefully neutral. The drive to the boarding school would take 4 hours. My father had planned the route to avoid any stops where I might draw attention or seek help. My mother sat in the back with me, ostensibly for company but really as a guard. 20 minutes into the drive, my father's phone rang. He answered through the car's Bluetooth, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern. The boarding school was calling about a documentation issue, something about my medical records not matching their requirements. They pulled into a gas station to sort out the paperwork. My mother stayed in the car with me while my father made calls, his frustration growing with each conversation. The boarding school's intake coordinator was being surprisingly thorough about verification. Through the window, I watched my father pace, his jaw clenched. My mother drummed her fingers on her knee, the rhythm matching one of her old recipe card warnings about his building anger. We both recognized the signs. Another call came through, this time from the therapist's office. There was confusion about my diagnosis codes, inconsistencies in the treatment notes. The secretary apologized profusely, but insisted they needed clarification before releasing my files to the boarding school. My father's voice rose loud enough to hear through the closed windows. He demanded to speak to supervisors, threatened to file complaints. But the boarding school had strict intake requirements, and without proper documentation, they couldn't accept me. An hour passed at the gas station. My mother grew increasingly nervous as my father's anger escalated. She suggested they return home and sort things out, but he refused to admit defeat. This was supposed to be the final solution to their problem child. Finally, my father stormed back to the car, slamming the door hard enough to make us both flinch. He announced we were going to the therapist's office to demand the records in person. The detour would add another hour to our journey. At the therapist's office, the receptionist apologetically explained that the therapist was with clients all day. The records could be released, but it would take time to compile everything properly. My father's barely controlled rage filled the waiting room. Other patients stared as he argued with the staff. A mother pulled her young son closer, whispering that they could reschedule. The receptionist's hands shook as she tried to explain the office's policies about record releases. My mother suggested they make an appointment for later in the week, sort everything out properly. But my father had taken time off work for this, had told everyone I'd be gone. Returning home with me would be admitting failure, showing weakness. The office manager emerged, drawn by the commotion. She calmly but firmly explained that without proper authorization forms, which seemed to be missing from my file, they couldn't release comprehensive records. She offered to expedite the process if my father would fill out new forms. While my parents dealt with paperwork, I sat in the waiting room, the folded paper from Thay burning in my pocket. Through the window, I could see normal people living normal lives, unaware of the prison closing around me. My father's phone rang again, the boarding school calling to say they'd need to postpone my intake until the documentation issues were resolved. They had another student arriving tomorrow who had priority. The next available slot would be in 2 weeks. The drive home was silent except for my father's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. My mother stared out the window, probably calculating which recipe card strategies might diffuse his building rage. I kept my head down, trying to remain invisible. Back home, my bags were dumped in my room with disgust. My father immediately got on the phone with the boarding school, demanding explanations. My mother retreated to the kitchen, pulling out ingredients for his favorite meal, damage control through food. That evening, Evan and Thay returned from her apartment. She watched the family dynamics with those sharp eyes, noting my father's barely contained fury and my mother's frantic peacekeeping. When Evan snapped at me for breathing too loudly, she touched his arm again. The next morning brought new complications. The therapist's office called to say they'd found discrepancies in my file, session notes that didn't match billing records, diagnoses that had changed without proper documentation. They'd need to conduct an internal review before releasing anything. My father accused them of incompetence, threatened legal action. But the office manager remained firm. Patient rights and proper procedures had to be followed. The review would take at least a week, possibly 2. Meanwhile, the boarding school called with more concerns. My academic records from the school showed inconsistencies with what my parents had reported. They'd need official transcripts and teacher recommendations, not just parental statements about my behavior. Each obstacle increased my father's rage and my mother's anxiety. The recipe card system had no strategy for institutional bureaucracy. Their carefully constructed narrative was meeting its first real challenge. Systems with procedures that couldn't be manipulated through charm or intimidation. I used the reprieve to secretly retrieve the emergency phone from the park bathroom. Millie had left new messages. She'd been working with someone, gathering information. She couldn't say more but urged me to hold on just a little longer. The therapist's office called again. During their review, they discovered that several of my session notes had been edited after the fact, raising red flags in their system. They'd need to interview me separately to verify the accuracy of my records. My father tried to prevent the interview, but the office manager explained it was now a matter of professional ethics and potentially legal liability. If I didn't appear for the interview, they'd have to report the irregularities to the state licensing board. The interview was scheduled for the following Monday. My father would have to allow it or risk an investigation that might expose his careful manipulations. The boarding school, learning of the complications, pushed my intake date back indefinitely. That weekend, the house felt like a powder keg. My father's public persona cracked during softball practice when he snapped at one of the girls for missing an easy catch. Parents exchanged concerned looks. His carefully built reputation showed its first fissure. They started visiting daily, always finding reasons to be present. She brought homework for Evan, helped my mother with dinner, created a buffer that made it harder for violence to escalate. Her constant presence was both protection and witness. The night before my therapist interview, I found my mother in the bathroom, staring at a bottle of pills. Not to harm herself, but calculating. How many would keep my father calm? How many would make him sleep through my appointment? The recipe cards had failed. She was improvising. Monday arrived with my father insisting on accompanying me to the interview, but the office manager explained that ethics required them to speak with me alone. He could wait in the lobby, but the interview would be private. Inside the office, a different therapist asked careful questions about my previous sessions. She'd reviewed the notes and found troubling inconsistencies. Did I remember saying certain things? Had my regular therapist accurately represented our conversations? I chose my words carefully, aware that too much truth could backfire. But I confirmed enough discrepancies to validate their concerns. The therapist took notes, her expression growing more troubled with each answer. The interview revealed that multiple session notes had been altered to support a specific narrative, one that painted me as increasingly unstable and resistant to treatment. The therapist explained they'd need to investigate further, possibly involving their legal team. My father waited in the lobby, his rage visible to everyone. When we finally left, he said nothing, but I could feel the violence radiating from him. At home, my mother had prepared his favorite dinner and strategically placed his preferred beer within reach. That night, they stayed for dinner again. Her presence meant my father had to maintain his facade, though it was cracking. When he started to raise his voice about the therapist's incompetence, she smoothly changed the subject to Evan's upcoming job interview. The next day, the school called. They'd completed their review of my records and found concerning patterns. My sudden decline coincided with specific events at home. They wanted to schedule a meeting with a social worker to ensure I was receiving appropriate support. My father tried to refuse, but the school explained it wasn't optional. State law required them to follow up on certain indicators. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday, with or without parental cooperation. Wednesday brought another call from the boarding school. They decided to reject my application entirely. The documentation issues, combined with inconsistencies in my history, made me unsuitable for their program. They wished us luck finding appropriate treatment elsewhere. My father's perfect solution had crumbled. The boarding school rejection meant I'd remain home, a constant reminder of his failure to control the narrative. His public image was tarnishing as whispers spread about his behavior at softball practice. The social worker meeting couldn't be avoided. My father attempted to charm her, but she'd seen too many families like ours. She asked probing questions, took notes about our family dynamics, scheduled follow-up visits. That evening, I heard my parents arguing in their room. My mother suggested they try a different approach, family counseling maybe, or letting me return to regular school. My father's response was sharp enough to make her cry. They had started a routine of checking on me directly, always with Evan present but finding ways to assess my well-being. She brought me books, mentioned resources casually, created tiny windows of hope in my isolation. The therapist's office concluded their investigation. They'd found enough irregularities to report the situation to the state licensing board. My regular therapist would face review. The office could no longer treat me without risking their practice. Without therapeutic support for their narrative, my parents' options narrowed. The social worker's follow-up visit was scheduled. The school was monitoring my situation. The community whispers were growing louder. My father's softball team lost their next game badly. His distraction was obvious, his temper shorter. One parent quietly suggested their daughter might benefit from a different coach next season. The hero facade was crumbling. I found Thay's phone number and memorized it, destroying the paper. Having an ally, even a limited one, changed everything. She couldn't save me directly, but her presence created accountability my parents couldn't ignore. The social worker's second visit brought more questions. She wanted to interview each family member separately. My father tried to refuse, but she explained that cooperation was better than forcing official intervention. During my interview, I stayed careful but truthful. Yes, things were stressful at home. Yes, I sometimes felt unsafe. No, I wasn't ready to make specific allegations. The social worker noted everything, promising to maintain regular contact. My mother's interview revealed cracks in her facade. She contradicted my father's timeline of events, mentioned stress that didn't align with their narrative. The social worker recognized the patterns of an abuse victim trying to protect everyone. Evan refused to participate meaningfully, giving one-word answers. But they, who happened to be visiting, offered observations about family dynamics that supported concerning patterns. Her credibility as an outsider carried weight. The social worker recommended family counseling with a new therapist, one they couldn't manipulate. She'd monitor compliance. Failure to participate would trigger more intensive intervention. My father had no choice but to agree. His public image depended on appearing cooperative. But I could see the rage building, the loss of control eating at him. The recipe cards couldn't predict this scenario. That night, I used the emergency phone to update Millie. The system was finally seeing cracks in my parents' story. It wasn't salvation, but it was progress. She promised to keep working from her end. The new family therapist proved immune to my father's charm. She identified concerning dynamics immediately, challenged the narrative my parents had constructed. Each session chipped away at their carefully built facade. My mother started slipping. Without her recipe card system, she couldn't manage my father's moods effectively. His anger had nowhere to go but inward, poisoning the household atmosphere even more. The social worker maintained regular contact, checking on my well-being. The school required weekly updates on my status. The therapist documented everything. The net of accountability grew tighter. My father's reputation continued deteriorating. His softball team finished last in the league. Parents whispered about his volatility. The speaking engagement about troubled teens was quietly canceled. His influence on Evan grew stronger. She challenged his anger, suggested healthier coping mechanisms. He wasn't ready to change, but cracks appeared in his armor. Sometimes I caught him looking at our father with something like recognition. The boarding school documentation disaster had created a paper trail nobody could ignore. Altered therapy notes, inconsistent records, manufactured diagnoses, evidence of systematic manipulation preserved in official files. 6 weeks after the failed boarding school attempt, I sat in family therapy as my father struggled to maintain his narrative. The therapist pushed back against every manipulation, every attempt to shift blame. His frustration was palpable. My mother had stopped trying to mediate. Without her recipe cards, she seemed lost, unable to navigate the changing dynamics. Sometimes she looked at me with something almost like apology. The social worker announced she'd be transitioning my case to regular monitoring rather than intensive intervention. The family was participating in therapy. I was safe enough. Progress was being documented. But she'd remain involved. That evening, my father retreated to his study, defeated. His grand plan had failed spectacularly. I wasn't in boarding school, wasn't silenced, wasn't broken. The systems he'd tried to manipulate had instead created accountability. I retrieved the emergency phone one last time. Millie's message was simple. She'd been accepted to graduate school nearby and would have stable housing soon. When I turned 18 in 6 months, I'd have somewhere to go. The therapy continued, each session documenting the reality my parents had tried to hide. My father's control slipped further. My mother's enabling became harder to maintain. Even Evan couldn't ignore the dysfunction anymore. 3 months later, I returned to regular school with a safety plan in place. The social worker checked in monthly. The therapist maintained careful documentation. My father's public persona never fully recovered from the cracks. They helped me apply for colleges far from home. She proofread essays, drove me to interviews, created possibilities my parents couldn't destroy. Her quiet support proved more powerful than any dramatic intervention. My 18th birthday approached with my father's power diminished but not eliminated. He still controlled the household, still inflicted damage, but within limits now. The system had created boundaries he couldn't cross without consequences. The night before my birthday, I packed carefully. Not everything. That would trigger retaliation. Just essentials, hidden in a school backpack. Millie had arranged everything, working quietly from a distance. My mother found me in the kitchen at dawn, both of us unable to sleep. She looked older, defeated by the collapse of her survival system. We didn't speak, but she pressed something into my hand, a recipe card with an address. I left that morning for school and didn't return. Millie met me at a coffee shop near campus, her apartment ready. The emergency phone had served its purpose. The documentation would protect me if my parents tried to force me back. The transition wasn't smooth. Trauma doesn't vanish with geography. But Millie and I began the slow work of healing, of breaking generational patterns. We attended therapy separately and together, processing years of systematic abuse. My parents made attempts to regain control. Wellness checks called in, missing person reports filed. But the documentation trail protected me. The social worker confirmed I'd left voluntarily. The therapist supported my decision. Evan reached out once through they. He wasn't ready to leave yet. Wasn't ready to see our father clearly. But cracks had formed in his armor. Maybe someday he'd find his own path to freedom. I worked part-time while finishing high school from Millie's apartment. We cooked dinner together, created new traditions, slowly built a life free from violence and manipulation. Some nights were harder than others. The recipe cards my mother had given me contained her sister's address, the one who'd escaped years ago. An invitation, perhaps, or just acknowledgement that she'd known all along what she'd enabled. I kept it but didn't use it. 6 months later, I started college with loans and scholarships my father couldn't touch. Millie drove me to campus, both of us crying at this impossible victory. We'd survived what was meant to destroy us.